When I came home from my husband's funeral, my suitcases were sitting on the porch like somebody else's trash. For a moment I truly thought I had gone to the wrong house. It was one of those gray afternoons where the sky hangs low and heavy, and everything looks flatter than it should. The funeral flowers were still in the back seat of my car, their sweet, rotting smell thick in the air. I remember turning off the engine and just staring at the front door. My black dress clung to me in all the wrong places, damp with sweat and the chill of church air conditioning. My feet ached. My face felt stiff from holding myself together for other people. And there they were. 2 blue suitcases. My old overnight bag. A cardboard box with the Afghan my sister had crocheted for me 20 years ago sticking out of the top. Just sitting there. At first, my mind refused to understand what my eyes were seeing. Grief can do that to you. It makes ordinary things look strange and terrible things look ordinary. Then I noticed the lock on the front door. Bright brass. New. I sat there gripping the steering wheel until my fingers hurt. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower droned on like nothing in the world had happened. A dog barked twice and went quiet. The whole neighborhood looked the same as it had looked yesterday, and that was what made it feel so cruel. My husband had been buried less than 3 hours ago, and the world had already moved on. I opened the car door and stepped out slowly, like I was approaching the scene of an accident. By the time I reached the porch, the front door swung open. Tiffany stood there in cream-colored loungewear and fuzzy slippers, one hand resting on her hip, the other still on the knob as if she had been waiting for me. My daughter-in-law always looked put together in a way that seemed almost aggressive. Even in slippers, she looked like she was making a point. Her hair was slicked back into a neat bun. Her nails were freshly done, pale pink glossy. Not a hair out of place. Not a crease in her clothes. I looked at her, then at the lock, then back at her again. "Tiffany," I said, and my own voice startled me. It sounded scraped raw. "Why are my things out here?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked over me. My funeral hat in my hand, my swollen face, my black stockings with a run in one calf. And there was something in her expression I had never seen so plainly before. Relief. Not sympathy. Not awkwardness. Relief. "I think this is for the best, Sandra," she said. For the best. I actually laughed then, one short broken sound that didn't feel like mine. For the best. I repeated. "I just buried my husband." She folded her arms. "And Caleb has finally made a decision." At the sound of my son's name, something tightened in my chest. "Where is Caleb?" "He took the girls to my mother's," she said. "He didn't want a scene." I looked past her into the hallway. My hallway. The narrow table Harold had refinished with his own hand stood against the wall. The little ceramic bowl where he always dropped his keys was still there. The framed family photo from Myrtle Beach still hung crooked because Harold insisted it looked charming that way. Every inch of that house carried the fingerprints of my life. "Open the door," I said. Tiffany shook her head once, as calmly as if she were refusing a second slice of pie. "No." I stepped closer. "This is my home." She gave me a long flat look. It was Harold's house. And now Harold is gone. There are moments when a sentence enters your body like a blade. Not because it is loud or dramatic, but because it is said so plainly. That was one of them. I stared at her, trying to understand how another woman could stand in front of a grieving widow and speak with such clean, polished cruelty. Then she said the thing I would hear in my sleep for months afterward. "Caleb chose his real family," she said. "It's time for you to let go." My ears rang. I don't know how long I stood there before I realized my mouth had fallen open. A breeze lifted the tissue paper from one of the funeral flower arrangements in the car and sent it skittering across the driveway. My black handbag slipped from my shoulder and landed against my leg. "His real family?" I said quietly. Tiffany's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. "You've leaned on him too much for too long. He has a wife. He has children. He has responsibilities. He can't keep carrying you. Carrying me." For 32 years I had cooked in that kitchen, washed those sheets, painted those walls, stretched every paycheck, and held that family together with the kind of labor nobody notices until it stops. I had stayed up through fevers and college applications and Harold's blood pressure scares and Caleb's teenage silence. I had packed lunches, signed forms, sat through funerals, and smiled through holidays when my own heart was tired. And this girl, because in that moment that's what she felt like to me, Not a wife, not a mother, just a girl playing queen in somebody else's castle, was telling me I had been carried. Get my son on the phone, I said. He doesn't want to talk right now. Get him on the phone. She sighed the way people do when a child is being difficult. Sandra, please don't make this harder than it has to be. I could feel my heart pounding high in my throat. Harder, I said. You changed the locks while I was burying my husband. Her face hardened. Because if we waited, you would guilt him into changing his mind. That was when I understood something I should have admitted to myself years earlier. This had not started today. Today was just the day Tiffany stopped pretending. I looked again at the suitcases. She had packed them herself, I realized. Not carefully. Not lovingly. My sweaters were shoved in crooked. One of my church hats was bent at the brim. The box with the Afghan also held framed photographs, loose pill bottles, and a pair of Harold's reading glasses wrapped in one of my dish towels. That nearly undid me. His glasses. I picked them up with shaking hands. One lens had a smudge on it. I had cleaned those glasses every Sunday morning for years because Harold always made them worse somehow, breathing too hard on the lenses and rubbing them with the tail of his shirt. For a second I couldn't breathe. Tiffany's voice came from farther away now, muffled by the rush in my ears. I put your medication in the side pocket of the blue case. I'm not heartless. I looked up at her then. Really looked at her. No, I said softly. Heartless people usually don't announce themselves. She blinked, but only once. Then from the side yard, old Mrs. Pritchard's curtain twitched. I knew she was watching. Half the block probably was. Public humiliation has a smell to it. People can sense it from behind walls. I lifted my chin because I was raised by a mother who believed dignity was something nobody could hand you, and nobody could take if you refused to drop it. Tell Caleb, I said, that I came home. Tiffany said nothing. I picked up one suitcase, then the other. My arms trembled from the weight of them and from everything else. Before I turned away, I looked past her one last time into the house where half my life still sat breathing my name from the walls. That was the day I learned grief and betrayal do not arrive one after the other. Sometimes they walk through the door together. Before Harold died, I would have told you we were an ordinary family. Not perfect. Never perfect. But ordinary in the way that long marriages are ordinary, stitched together with habit, compromise, affection, and the quiet rhythm of shared years. Harold and I had been married 32 years. And in all that time we had lived in only 2 houses. The first was a tiny rental with thin walls and a stove that leaned slightly to the left. We were young then, too young to know how much life could ask of a person. Harold worked at the feed store during the day and unloaded trucks at night. I did hair in the back room of a beauty shop 3 days a week and cleaned offices on weekends until Caleb came along. We were tired all the time, but we were building something, and when you're building something with the person you love, even struggle can feel warm. The second house was the one on Juniper Lane. Not fancy. Never fancy. A brick ranch with a narrow front porch, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen that always seemed just a little too small once holidays rolled around, and a patch of hydrangeas out front that Harold fussed over as if they were our 3rd child. We bought it when Caleb was 7, after 3 years of clipping coupons, skipping vacations, and Harold taking every overtime shift his back would allow. I still remember the first night we slept there. We didn't have curtains up yet, and moonlight poured through the windows onto the hardwood floor. We ate takeout fried chicken sitting cross-legged in the living room because our dining table hadn't arrived. Harold kept grinning at me like he had stolen something precious and gotten away with it. Listen, he whispered. I said, to what? He smiled wider. Quiet. It's ours. That house became the shape of our life. I painted Caleb's room yellow when he was little because he was afraid of the dark and said yellow looked like morning. Harold built bookshelves in the den after I complained that paperbacks were taking over every surface. We measured Caleb against the pantry doorframe year after year, each penciled line higher than the last. There were Thanksgiving turkeys, Christmases where the heat went out, arguments over bills, makeups over coffee, Bible study meetings, flu seasons, broken appliances, and summer evenings with the windows open and the smell of cut grass drifting in. Nothing extraordinary from the outside. Everything from the inside. Caleb grew into a quiet man, thoughtful in some ways, avoidant in others. As a boy, he had Harold's eyes and my tendency to carry his feelings like something fragile and private. He was never the kind to slam doors or shout much. If he was upset, he went silent. If he was ashamed, he got helpful. That was how he was built. When he married Tiffany, I tried, Lord knows I tried, to welcome her. She was pretty, bright, organized, and confident in a way I thought might be good for Caleb. They met at a regional insurance office where he handled claims and she worked in client services. She came from one of those families who always seemed polished. Her mother wore perfume to the grocery store and called casseroles bakes. Her father had opinions about wine and handshakes and the proper way to fold napkins. Nothing wrong with that exactly. It was just different. At first, Tiffany made a show of including me. Sandra, I need your potato salad recipe. Sandra, how did you get gravy that smooth? Sandra, tell me how Caleb liked his shirts folded when he was little. She called me Mama Sandra in front of people, all sweetness and dimples. But there was always something just underneath. Pause too long before saying thank you. A compliment with a soft edge hidden inside it. She'd smile and say things like, I don't know how you kept house this way for so many years. I'd go crazy with so much clutter. Or, Caleb says you still remind him to take his vitamins. That's adorable. Adorable. Some words can shrink a woman if you let them. I told myself I was imagining it. That maybe this was just the difference between her generation and mine. She liked clean lines, labels and pantry bins, and speaking in that breezy tone some people use when they want to sound relaxed but are actually measuring the room. I liked heavy wooden furniture, handwritten recipes, and saying what I meant. Harold saw some of it before I did, or at least before I admitted it. One night after Caleb and Tiffany had left from Sunday dinner, Harold stood at the sink rinsing plates while I wrapped leftover roast in foil. The dishwasher hummed, and there was gravy cooling in a pan on the stove. He said without turning around, That girl doesn't like sharing him. I looked up. Who, Tiffany? He shrugged. She smiles with all her teeth but not much with her eyes. I laughed because it was such a Harold thing to say. He was a quiet observer, the kind of man who noticed how people treated waitresses and whether they returned borrowed tools. She's still adjusting, I said. Marriage changes things. He dried his hands and leaned against the counter. Maybe. Just don't let anybody make you feel unwelcome in your own life, Sandy. That was what he called me when he was serious. Sandy. At the time I kissed his cheek and told him he was being dramatic. Looking back, I think he was trying to warn me in the only way he knew how. The first real shift happened after our first granddaughter, Lila, was born. Motherhood softened Tiffany in some ways and sharpened her in others. She became more territorial, more controlling about holidays, routines, and access. Suddenly there were rules. We had to text before dropping by, which I understood. We had to avoid kissing the baby because of germs, which I also understood. But then there were newer rules that seemed to arrive whenever she wanted to remind us where the power sat. Don't bring too many gifts because it overstimulates the child. Please don't use nicknames unless we approve them. We're creating our own traditions now. That last one came with a smile over Thanksgiving coffee, as though tradition were something a family could just rebrand like a business. Harold stayed gentler with Caleb than I sometimes wanted him to be. Give the boy room, he'd say. He's trying to keep the peace. But there comes a point in some marriages where keeping the peace really means surrendering it. Still, we managed. We adjusted. We let them host more often. We bit our tongues when Tiffany rearranged place settings I had already laid out or corrected me about what the girls could eat in my own kitchen. We told ourselves this was the natural give and take of family. Then Harold got sick. First it was small things. Fatigue he blamed on age. A cough that lingered. Less appetite. I noticed because wives notice. He moved slower in the mornings. He started falling asleep in his recliner before the 10 o'clock news. He stopped asking for seconds at supper. Go to the doctor, I told him. I'm fine, he said, which is what men of a certain generation say even when they are not. By the time he finally went, fine had become scans, blood work, specialist appointments, and words no wife ever forgets hearing in a room that smells like sanitizer and old coffee. Aggressive. Advanced. Treatment options. The months that followed rearranged all of us. Hospital corridors. Medication schedules. The dry rustle of insurance papers. The beep of machines. The metallic taste of fear in my mouth every time a doctor entered with a tablet in his hand. Our house, once so steady, became part pharmacy, part prayer room, part waiting room. And through all of it, Tiffany changed again. At first, she appeared useful. She brought over soups in labeled containers. She offered to organize appointments in a shared calendar. She used words like support system and boundaries and sustainable caregiving. Caleb seemed grateful for her efficiency. So did I in the beginning. But gradually, I started noticing how often her help came with control attached. She wanted copies of Harold's medication list. She asked questions about the mortgage, the bills, the insurance policies, all in that clipped practical tone that made everything sound reasonable. She started referring to the house as the property. I remember the first time she said it. We were in my kitchen, and Harold had just drifted off in the den after a rough morning. The house smelled faintly of Vicks chicken broth, and the lemon cleaner I used too much when I was anxious. Tiffany stood by the counter scrolling through something on her phone. You and Harold should really think about a long-term plan for the property, she said. I frowned. The property? She looked up. The house. It's our home, I said. She gave a tiny shrug. Sure. I just mean legally. I dried my hands on a dish towel and looked at her more carefully. She was standing in my kitchen wearing a cream trench coat that probably cost more than my first used car, tapping one manicured nail against her phone case as if she were discussing a storage unit, and not the place where my husband was trying not to die 2 rooms away. What long-term plan? I asked. Tiffany lowered her voice, though Harold was asleep and the television in the den was murmuring softly. I'm just saying if things get worse, Caleb will have to step in. It would be smart to make sure everything is simple. No confusion. No probate issues. No unnecessary stress. There was something about how quickly she said it. Smooth, rehearsed, almost cheerful, that made my stomach turn. We have things handled, I said. She smiled. Of course. I didn't mean to offend you. But she had. And not because she was practical. Practical is one thing. Practical brings casseroles and pays bills on time. Practical sits beside a hospital bed and asks the nurse the right questions. This was something else. This was a woman checking where the exits were before the fire had even spread. That evening after she left, I told Harold what she had said. He was in his recliner with a blanket over his legs, thinner already than he had been at Christmas, his wedding ring loose enough now that he twisted it absently with his thumb. He listened quietly, eyes on the muted television. Then he said, "Bring me the metal box from the hall closet." I stared at him. The metal box? You know the one. I did. It was an old gray lockbox we kept on the top shelf behind extra towels and a bag of winter scarves. Important papers lived there. Insurance forms, tax records, my mother's death certificate, the title to Harold's truck. I got it down and set it on the coffee table in front of him. He opened it slowly, not because he was dramatic but because his hands hurt by then. He flipped through folders until he found a manila envelope with my name, written across the front in his blocky, slanted handwriting. Sandra. My chest tightened. Harold, what is this? Something I should have gone over sooner. I didn't like the sound of that. You're not going anywhere, I said too quickly. He looked up at me with tired eyes and gave me that sad little smile sick people sometimes give the healthy, as if they're trying to ease your burden while carrying their own. Come sit down, he said. So I sat. The lamp beside his chair cast a warm yellow circle over the papers in his lap. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches and tapped them against the siding. The whole house felt suspended, breath held. Harold cleared his throat. The deed is in both our names, but with right of survivorship. If I pass, the house becomes yours outright. No one touches it unless you say so. I blinked. All right. He studied me. You knew that. Not in those exact words, I admitted. I just knew we owned it together. He nodded. I wanted it plain. Then he took another envelope from the box. This one was sealed. And this, he said, resting his hand over it for a moment, is my will. I stared at the envelope, then at him. Why are you showing me this now? Because I've been watching. His voice was soft, but there was steel under it. And because I know our son. That made me go still. Harold loved Caleb in that deep, quiet, bone-level way good fathers do. But he was never blind to him. Where I still saw the little boy with skinned knees and a cowlick, Harold saw the man my son was becoming. The hesitations, the weakness for avoiding discomfort, the dangerous way he let stronger personalities steer him when he didn't want conflict. "What do you mean?" I asked. He took a long breath. "I mean, Caleb hates making hard people unhappy. And Tiffany counts on that." I looked down at my hands. I had thought it, felt it, maybe even known it in pieces. But hearing Harold say it aloud made it solid in a way I couldn't soften anymore. "She's his wife," I said, though I wasn't sure whether I was defending her or mourning him. "Yes," Harold said. "And you are his mother." That should never have become a contest. The room was quiet except for the furnace kicking on. He handed me the sealed envelope. "If anything happens to me, take this to Mr. Benton. Your lawyer." "Our lawyer." I nodded, but tears were already pressing hot behind my eyes. Harold reached for my hand. His palm felt drier than I remembered, the skin thinner, papery. "Listen to me, Sandy." I looked up. "No matter what anybody says later, that house is your home. Not Caleb's. Not Tiffany's. Yours. You stay there as long as you want, and you do not let anybody rush you, guilt you, or talk around you." I tried to joke because that was easier than crying. "Who's talking around me?" But Harold didn't smile. Instead, he said something that chilled me more than any diagnosis had. "If they push too hard after I'm gone, it won't be grief talking." I wanted to argue. I wanted to say our son would never. I wanted to say Tiffany was difficult, yes, but not cruel. I wanted to preserve the picture of our family, while there was still time to stand inside it. But all I managed was, "Why would you say that?" Harold looked toward the hallway where the family photographs hung in neat rows. Caleb in his little league uniform, Caleb at prom, Caleb holding baby Lila with terrified tenderness. All those frozen versions of us pretending life could stay still if we framed it neatly enough. Then he said, "Because I've seen the way she looks at this place." The next few weeks moved fast and slow at the same time, the way illness always does. Days packed with tasks. Nights stretched thin with dread. Caleb came by often enough, but not with the steadiness I had once imagined for him. He'd stop in after work, stand by Harold's chair, ask, "How you feeling, Dad?" in that careful voice people use when they're already halfway braced for bad news. Then Tiffany would text, or one of the girls would need something, or there'd be some scheduling conflict, and he would leave before the hard parts of the evening, before the bath, before the medicine confusion, before the tremors, before I sat awake listening to Harold breathe. I don't say that to paint my son as heartless. Weakness and heartlessness are not the same thing. Caleb loved his father. I believe that. But love without courage can become a very disappointing thing. As Harold declined, Tiffany's help increased. She offered to sort our mail. She asked if I wanted her to make a spreadsheet of expenses. She started dropping by when she knew Caleb wasn't with her. Always with the same polite little knock and the same alert eyes scanning the room before she sat down. One afternoon, I came in from the pharmacy and found her standing in our bedroom doorway. Not inside, but close enough. I froze in the hall. She turned too quickly. "Oh, I was just looking for the bathroom." "The bathroom is the other direction," I said. Color rose in her cheeks, but she recovered fast. "Right. Sorry. Your hallway always confuses me." Our hallway. It was 12 feet long. I walked past her into the bedroom and saw that Harold's bedside drawer wasn't shut all the way. Inside were his insurance cards, his reading glasses, and the little notebook where he kept account numbers and reminders in his careful handwriting. I looked back at Tiffany. She gave me that same polished smile. "Do you need me to pick up the girls from dance?" she asked, as if nothing in the world were strange. That night I told Harold. He closed his eyes for a long moment, then opened them and said, "Tomorrow. Call Benton tomorrow." And I did. Mr. Benton had handled our paperwork for years. He was a broad-shouldered man with silver eyebrows and a voice like sanded wood. The next morning I drove to his office after a home health aide came to sit with Harold for 2 hours. I still remember the smell of stale coffee and legal paper when I stepped inside, and the way Mr. Benton's face changed the moment he saw me. He ushered me into his office, shut the door, and listened without interrupting. When I finished, he took off his glasses and folded them carefully. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said. Your husband updated several documents 3 months ago. I frowned. Updated? He nodded. At his request. A strange tightness crept into my chest. What did he change? Mr. Benton reached for a file, opened it, and slid a copy of the first page toward me. The house remains exactly as your husband described to you, he said. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Upon his passing, ownership transfers fully to you. There is no ambiguity there. I exhaled, though I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath. Additionally, he continued, your husband amended his will to make his intentions unmistakably clear. I looked down at the paper but couldn't make the legal language settle into meaning right away. There were too many words, too much black ink, too much fear humming in my body. Mr. Benton softened his tone. He wanted to ensure no one could pressure you to sell or vacate the home. There is also a separate letter of instruction, handwritten by your husband, that supports that intent. A handwritten letter. I thought of Harold at our kitchen table in the late evenings, glasses low on his nose, writing in that deliberate way of his. He had always believed that if something mattered, it ought to be put down plain. When did he do this? I asked. In March, Mr. Benton said. That was around the time Tiffany had first started asking about the property. I felt suddenly cold. Mr. Benton watched me for a moment and then said, has someone given you reason to believe this may become an issue? I wanted to say no. I wanted to maintain some small scrap of loyalty to the image of my family. But lawyers, unlike pastors and neighbors, do not need your politeness. They need the truth. So I told him. About Tiffany's questions. About finding her by our bedroom. About the way she spoke of the house as if my presence in it were temporary. About Harold telling me not to let anyone rush me. Mr. Benton's jaw tightened. If there is any attempt to remove you from the home, he said, you call me immediately. I nodded. He tapped the paper once. And let me be very clear, Mrs. Whitaker. If anyone tells you otherwise, they are either ignorant of the law or hoping you are. I left his office with copies in a large envelope and dread settled under my ribs like a stone. When I got home, Harold was awake. The light in the den fell across his face and made the hollows in his cheeks look deeper than they had the week before. Illness can erase a person in slow pencil marks. I sat beside him and told him what Mr. Benton had said. Harold closed his eyes and gave one short nod, as if a private concern had finally been confirmed. Then he asked, did Benton give you the note? I blinked. What note? His eyes opened again. The one for you. He was supposed to hold it unless. He didn't finish and he didn't have to. I reached into the envelope with trembling fingers. There, tucked behind the copies, was another sealed envelope with my name on it in Harold's handwriting. I looked at him. You wrote me a note and let another man keep it? A faint smile touched his mouth. Figured you'd open it too soon if I left it in the house. That was so like him that I almost laughed. Almost. Read it later, he said. Not now. Why? Because I want you looking at me while I'm still here. I bent forward and pressed my forehead against his hand. It smelled faintly of lotion and medicine and the sawdust that had lived in his skin for so many years I used to think even his bones were built of wood shavings and patience. He squeezed my fingers weakly. I'm sorry, he whispered. For what? For leaving you with this. I lifted my head and shook it hard. No, don't do that. But he kept looking at me in that clear, devastating way dying people sometimes do. As though they have no more energy for denial and can only offer the truth. I should have stepped in sooner, he said. With Caleb. With her. I kept thinking he'd find his backbone. Tears stung my eyes. He still might. Harold gave a tired exhale that could have been agreement or doubt. He's your baby, he said gently. He'll always be your baby. But he's a grown man now, Sandy. If he lets another person do wrong while he stands there quiet, that wrong belongs to him too. That sentence stayed with me long after the casseroles stopped coming and the sympathy cards dried out on the mantel. Harold died 12 days later, just before dawn. There is no graceful way to describe the death of a person you have loved for half your life. 1 minute I was adjusting his blanket and listening to the rattle in his chest, praying over a body that had become all sharp edges and effort. The next minute the room went still in a way I had never heard before. Even the clock on the dresser seemed to hesitate. I called hospice. I called Caleb. I called my sister. Then I sat beside Harold's body and pressed my hand over his because it was the only thing left to do. When Caleb arrived, he cried into my shoulder with the heavy, stunned grief of a little boy wearing a man's jacket. For that hour, maybe two, it was just us, just sorrow stripped clean of politics and practicalities. Then Tiffany came. She came with coffee for everyone, tissues in her bag, and a face arranged into solemn efficiency. She moved through my house whispering to people, making lists, opening and closing cabinet doors, asking where we kept extra extension cords for the lamp by the casket company's viewing stand. At one point she touched my elbow and said, "You should rest. I can handle things from here." From here? I was too numb to answer. The days after a death are dangerous that way. People call it support, but sometimes support arrives wearing control like a church hat. The funeral itself passed in a blur of perfume, handshakes, damp tissues, and terrible sentences. He looked so peaceful. At least he's no longer suffering. If you need anything, call me. Need anything. Most people mean it kindly, but grief quickly teaches you that very few people are offering the thing you actually need, which is impossible anyway. You don't need casserole. You don't need peonies. You need one impossible hour backward in time. At the church, Caleb stood beside me with his tie crooked and eyes red-rimmed. He held my hand during the final hymn. I remember thinking maybe Harold had been too harsh. Maybe loss would shake something awake in our son. Maybe grief would remind him who he was and where he came from. Tiffany cried elegantly. Even that sounds unkind to say, but it's true. Some women cry with their whole faces. Tiffany cried in controlled, shining lines that left her mascara almost untouched. At the graveside, the wind cut through my coat. Dirt thudded softly on polished wood. I watched the casket lower and felt as though the world had developed a crack too wide for me to cross. Afterward, people milled around saying those same helpless things. My sister hugged me hard enough to hurt. Mrs. Pritchard from down the street pressed a pound cake into my hands wrapped in foil. Caleb kissed my forehead and said, "I'll meet you back at the house, okay? Tiffany wants to drop the girls off at her mother's first." I was too tired to object. Too broken to read what now seems obvious. "All right," I said. He hugged me again, quickly this time, already half turned away. That was the last moment I saw my son before coming home to my suitcases on the porch. After I drove away from the house that afternoon, away from my own front steps, away from Tiffany standing in my doorway like a customs officer denying entry, I sat in the church parking lot 2 blocks over and finally opened Harold's letter. My hands were shaking so badly I tore the envelope crooked. Inside was one page folded twice. I knew the handwriting immediately. Firm. Plain. No wasted motion. "Sandy, if you are reading this, then things have likely happened the way I feared they might. First, know this. I loved you well, even if not perfectly. That house on Juniper Lane was built around your hands as much as mine. Every room in it holds your labor, your patience, your prayers, your meals, your mending, your laughter, and the pieces of your heart you gave this family. Do not let anybody speak to you as though you are a guest there." I had to stop reading because my vision blurred so badly the words swam off the page. Outside the windshield, the church parking lot shimmered in late afternoon light. Cars came and went. Somewhere nearby, children were laughing on a playground, and that ordinary sound nearly broke me more than the funeral had. The world was still moving. My husband was gone. My son had let me be put out of my own house. And children were laughing within earshot of all of it. I pressed the heel of my hand against my mouth and waited until I could see again. Then I kept reading. "Caleb is our son, and I love him. But love does not excuse weakness. If he stands silent while you are dishonored, that silence is his choice. Do not confuse it for helplessness. I have left clear instructions with Benton. Follow them. Do not argue from emotion when facts will do. Do not beg for what is already yours. And do not let shame drive your decisions. What is done in darkness often counts on decent people staying quiet. If Tiffany has involved herself, remember this. A person who reaches for something before the body is cold is not grieving. They are calculating. There are more things you do not yet know. Benton will explain. And Sandy, this matters most. You are not being carried. You carried us. I knew it then and I know it now. Stay steady. Stand straight. Let the truth do the heavy lifting. Love always, Harold. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, I was crying the kind of cry that empties you out and leaves your ribs aching. Not wild crying. Not loud. Just deep, helpless grief mixed with the peculiar humiliation of realizing your husband had prepared for your mistreatment because he knew the people closest to you too well. There are pains that come from strangers, and then there are pains that come from being accurately seen. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Then I sat still until my breathing calmed enough for me to drive. I did not go back to the house. Pride had nothing to do with it. I knew enough by then to understand that grief can make a woman vulnerable in ways opportunists love. If I returned to that porch angry, exhausted, and heartbroken, I might say too much, cry too hard, or let them make me feel unstable. And once people start calling a grieving woman emotional, they use that word to erase every fact she brings afterward. So I drove to my younger sister Evelyn's house. Evelyn opened the door before I could knock twice. One look at my face and she said, "What happened?" I held up Harold's letter in one hand and my house key in the other. "They changed the locks," I said. She actually stepped back as if I had slapped her. "They did what?" I repeated it slower this time because saying a terrible thing twice is one way the mind begins accepting that it happened. By the time I finished, Evelyn's own face had gone hard with outrage. "Come in," she said. "Right now." My sister had always been the sharper one. Where I smooth, she cuts. Where I wait, she moves. We loved each other fiercely, but our temperaments were different enough that as girls our mother used to say the Lord made us in balance so one wouldn't let the other be foolish for too long. Evelyn sat me at her kitchen table, put a mug of tea in front of me though neither of us touched it, and listened while I told her everything. The new lock, Tiffany's words, Caleb nowhere in sight, Harold's letter. When I finished, she made one small sound deep in her throat. That little witch. Normally I would have corrected her. Grief had made me less patient with manners. She said Caleb chose his real family, I whispered. Evelyn's eyes widened with fresh disbelief. She said that to your face? The day of Harold's funeral. I nodded. She's lost her mind. No, I said quietly, staring at the steam curling up from the tea. I think she's been in her right mind the whole time. I was just slower to accept what kind of mind it was. Evelyn reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. What do you want to do? I looked at Harold's letter again. Do not argue from emotion when facts will do. I want to call Benton. Then call him. So I did. Mr. Benton answered on the second ring. His voice changed the moment I told him what had happened. She changed the locks? He repeated. Yes. And your son? He wasn't there. A pause. Then, Mrs. Whitaker, listen carefully. Do not attempt to force your way in tonight. Do not speak to them further without a witness if you can help it. I'll contact them in the morning. If they removed your belongings from the home without your consent, that is useful information. Useful. It felt strange to hear my humiliation described in legal terms, but I understood what he meant. Facts. Documentation. Sequence. There's one more thing, he said. I straightened. What? Your husband's will contains a clause regarding occupancy, and any attempt to coerce or dispossess you. I gripped the phone tighter. What clause? Mr. Benton cleared his throat. If Caleb, directly or through his spouse, attempts to force a sale of the property, remove you from the property, or materially interfere with your peaceful residence there during your lifetime, certain financial provisions in Harold's will are revoked. For a moment I didn't understand. Then I did. What financial provisions? I asked, already knowing the answer would matter. The investment account your husband intended to leave for Caleb and the girls, Mr. Benton said. And a discretionary educational trust Harold established for the grandchildren, over which Caleb and Tiffany were not to have direct control. I went very still. Evelyn was watching my face from across the table, trying to read the conversation from my eyes alone. Harold had never talked much about money. Not because we lacked transparency, but because he believed savings should sit quietly until needed. We were not wealthy people. But Harold had done better than most at the plant, and after his retirement package and some careful investing over the years, he had set aside more than even I fully appreciated. He put that in writing? I said. Yes, Mr. Benton replied. Quite explicitly. He anticipated pressure. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. He knew them better than I wanted to. "I'm sorry," he said, and unlike most condolences, his sounded like it belonged to the specific shape of my pain. "What happens now?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning, I will send formal notice reminding them of the legal status of the property and the consequences of their conduct. If necessary, we can involve law enforcement to restore your access. But I'd prefer to begin by giving foolish people an opportunity to reconsider before they make things worse for themselves." Foolish people. That was kinder than the phrase forming in my own mind. After I hung up, I told Evelyn everything. She sat back slowly in her chair. "So let me get this straight. Harold suspected they'd try something, protected the house, protected the money, and left instructions that if they pulled exactly this kind of mess, they'd lose what he meant to leave them." "Yes." Evelyn whistled once low. "Your husband was quiet, but he wasn't dumb." "No," I said. He wasn't. For the first time that day, under all the grief and shame and disbelief, I felt something else. Not triumph. It was too soon for that, and I was too tired. It was steadiness. The kind Harold had always carried when something broke in the house or a bill came in higher than expected or somebody at church got loud over nonsense. He never panicked. He just got still, looked the problem in the face, and started with what was true. What was true was this. My husband was dead. My son had failed me. My daughter-in-law had overplayed her hand. And the house on Juniper Lane was still mine. That night, I slept in Evelyn's guest room under a faded quilt she'd had since her first marriage. I barely slept at all, really. Grief kept waking me in layers. Once because I reached for Harold and found cold sheets that weren't even mine. Once because I dreamed I was standing on my own porch with no door at all, just a wall where the entrance should be. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and sat in the dark by the window. Streetlight pooled over Evelyn's azaleas. The neighborhood was silent except for the occasional hiss of a passing tire on wet pavement. I thought about Caleb as a little boy, how he used to climb into our bed after thunderstorms and burrow against Harold's side. I thought about the first time he called Tiffany the one, grinning and embarrassed, as if joy itself needed permission. I thought about every holiday table, every school pickup, every stitched Halloween costume and birthday cake and prayer whispered over his sleeping head. People think betrayal cancels love. Doesn't. That's what makes it betrayal. By 8:30 the next morning, I was dressed, composed, and sitting in Mr. Benton's office with Harold's letter in my purse and a notebook in my lap. Grief had not lessened overnight, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the wild, disoriented pain of the funeral day. It had narrowed into something cleaner, colder, the kind of pain that can stand up straight and answer questions. Mr. Benton had asked me to come in person in case immediate paperwork was needed. Evelyn insisted on driving me and waiting in the reception area. "In case I need to identify bodies later," she muttered on the way over. I almost smiled. Inside, Mr. Benton closed the office door and got straight to it. "I spoke to your son's wife 20 minutes ago," he said. I blinked. "You spoke to Tiffany?" "Yes." "What did she say?" He removed his glasses, which I was beginning to understand meant he was annoyed. "She informed me that you had agreed it was time for a transition, and that your emotional state after the funeral made details difficult to discuss." I stared at him. "Agreed," I repeated. He nodded once. "She also referred to the house as a shared family asset, and suggested Caleb was acting in your best interests by temporarily relocating you." For a moment I was too stunned to speak. It is one thing to be mistreated. It is another to hear how neatly your mistreatment has already been translated into respectable language. "I never agreed to anything," I said. "I'm aware," Mr. Benton replied dryly. My response made that clear. He slid a typed letter across the desk. "This is the formal notice. I have emailed and couriered copies to both your son and Mrs. Whitaker." I read enough to feel my heartbeat settle into something steadier. It laid everything out plainly. Legal ownership of the property, unlawful exclusion, immediate demand for restored access, and notice that any attempt to coerce or dispossess me would trigger the penalty clause in Harold's will. Penalty clause. I could almost hear Harold saying, "Let the truth do the heavy lifting." "Will they listen?" I asked. Mr. Benton gave me the kind of look lawyers reserve for avoidable foolishness. Mrs. Whitaker, when money and liability become clear, many people suddenly rediscover good sense. As if summoned by the thought, his desk phone rang. He glanced at the number and said, "Speak of the devil." He put it on speaker after a brief pause. "Mr. Whitaker." Caleb's voice came through strained and too fast. "Mr. Benton, I just got your email. What is this?" "This," Mr. Benton said calmly, "is a notice regarding your mother's unlawful exclusion from her own home." There was silence on the line then. "That's not what happened." I closed my eyes, not because I was shocked, because disappointment can become tiring in the body. Mr. Benton's tone remained neutral. "Then you are welcome to explain." Caleb took a breath. "Tiffany said Mama needed space after the funeral," she said. "She said things were getting tense, and maybe it would be easier if she stayed with Aunt Evelyn for a few days while we sorted through Dad's things." I opened my eyes slowly and looked at the grain of the wood desk in front of me. Men tell on themselves in the words they choose. He had said Tiffany said twice before he had said one word that belonged to him. "Did your mother agree to this arrangement?" Mr. Benton asked. A longer silence this time. Then Caleb said much quieter, "Not exactly." "Did she consent to having the locks changed?" "No." "Did she consent to having her belongings removed?" "No." Mr. Benton folded his hands. "Then I suggest you stop describing this as an arrangement." Caleb's breathing crackled faintly over the speaker. "I didn't know Tiffany had already put the bags outside," he said at last. I laughed then, softly and without humor. There are apologies that begin too late and excuses that arrive too early. Caleb had somehow managed both. "Your mother is present," Mr. Benton said. "Would you like to speak with her?" Another pause. "Yes." Mr. Benton looked at me. I nodded. His voice gentle just slightly. "Sandra." I leaned toward the phone. "I'm here." The silence on Caleb's end felt alive, almost physical. Then he said, "Mama." I had waited all night to hear something in his voice that sounded like my son again. Remorse, confusion, urgency, anything. What I heard instead was a grown man standing in the ruins of his own cowardice, hoping tenderness might still save him from consequence. "Why?" I asked. Just that one word. No shouting. No lecture. No tears. "Why?" Caleb exhaled shakily. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." I looked down at my wedding ring, at the pale groove it had made in my finger over 3 decades. "That isn't an answer," I said. He tried again. "Tiffany thought, we thought maybe after the funeral there'd be too much emotion, and maybe if you stayed with Aunt Evelyn for a bit." "My husband had been buried for less than 3 hours," I said. "My suitcases were on the porch." His voice cracked then. "I know. Did you know before it happened?" "No," he said quickly. "Not exactly. She said she was going to pack some things in case you wanted space. I didn't know she changed the locks until after we dropped the girls at her mother's." "Then why didn't you call me?" He had no answer for that. I think that was the moment something finally settled in me. Not hatred. Not even anger exactly. Just clarity. Because there are times when the person who harms you directly is not the only one you grieve. Sometimes you also grieve the person who stood nearby and let it happen because confrontation was inconvenient. Mr. Benton stepped back in. "Mr. Whitaker, your mother's access must be restored immediately. If this matter is not resolved today, further steps will be taken. Additionally, you should review the section of your father's will referenced in my notice." "What section?" Caleb asked, but I could hear from the shift in his tone that he already knew it was bad. "The section regarding interference with your mother's residence and the resulting revocation of certain bequests." This time the silence was longer. Then, "What bequests?" Mr. Benton named them. "The investment account, the educational trust, the conditions." A chair scraped loudly on the other end. Caleb let out one stunned breath that sounded almost like he'd been hit. "You've got to be kidding me. Your father was not a man known for joking in legal documents," Mr. Benton said. "What did Tiffany do?" Caleb muttered, though whether he was speaking to us or himself I couldn't tell. Mr. Benton's voice turned firm. "I advise you to think less about assigning blame and more about remedying the harm immediately. The call ended soon after. Caleb said he would handle it, which by then I understood to mean he had finally found the edge of his comfort and discovered, too late, that it cut. An hour later my phone rang. Tiffany. I stared at her name on the screen until it stopped. Then it rang again. Mr. Benton looked at me. You do not have to answer. But I did. I put it on speaker. Her voice came out tight and clipped, all softness gone. Sandra, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Evelyn, from the doorway where she had quietly entered with a styrofoam cup of vending machine coffee, made a sound like a snort and had to cover it with a cough. I kept my voice calm. A misunderstanding? Yes. We were only trying to help. Caleb was worried about you being alone in the house after Harold passed. And, did Caleb tell you to change the locks? No, but, did Caleb tell you to put my things on the porch? A beat too long. I made a judgment call. There it is, Evelyn muttered. Tiffany ignored that. Sandra, I think everyone is very emotional right now. Another useful sentence. Another attempt to turn theft into concern. Cruelty into management. I said. You told me my son had chosen his real family. Her voice dropped half a register. I was upset. No, I said. You were honest. The line went quiet. Then she said, you don't understand the pressure Caleb is under. I almost pitied her then, because some people are so devoted to their own logic they cannot hear how revealing they sound. No, I said. You don't understand what Harold prepared for. For the first time since I had known her, Tiffany had nothing ready. No polished phrase. No managerial tone. No soft smile tucked into her voice. What does that mean? She asked. It means, I said, that my husband knew exactly what kind of pressure you were planning to apply after he died. Her breath caught sharply over the line. I let the silence sit there. Not to punish her. To force her to feel the shape of what she had done without language rushing in to cushion it. When she spoke again, the confidence was thinner. Sandra, I think you're making this much bigger than it needs to be. That sentence told me everything. To people like Tiffany, consequences always feel bigger than the harm that caused them. Mr. Benton leaned forward and said, in the same measured tone he might use to explain a tax deadline, Mrs. Whitaker, this office has formally notified your household of the legal implications already. I advise immediate compliance. The line went dead. Evelyn let out the breath she'd been holding. Well, she said. That woman finally swallowed her own tongue. By noon Caleb called again. This time there was no speakerphone. I stepped into the hallway outside Mr. Benton's office and answered alone. Mama, he said, voice rough. I'm at the house. I could hear movement behind him, cabinet doors maybe, or footsteps. For a second, hearing the sounds of my own home through a telephone line made me so angry I had to grip the wall. And? I asked. I changed the lock back. My jaw tightened. Back to what? To your original deadbolt. I found the old hardware in the garage. Of course he had. Because these things are never as irreversible as the people doing them want you to believe. And Tiffany? I asked. A pause. She took the girls to her mother's. I waited. Then he said it. She didn't think Dad would do something like this. Like this. Not she was wrong. Not we violated your home. Not even. I'm sorry in full. Just surprised that Harold had anticipated disloyalty and arranged his affairs accordingly. I looked out the office window at the parking lot, at a man loading file boxes into his trunk, at ordinary life carrying on under a bright indifferent sky. Your father knew you, I said. And he knew her. Mama, please. No. Don't please me now. My voice never rose. Didn't have to. When I came home from burying my husband, I said, my things were on the porch. Your wife stood in my doorway and told me you had chosen your real family. And wherever you were in that moment, Caleb, you were not where your mother needed you to be. He was crying by then. I could hear him trying not to. I messed up. Yes, I said. I can fix it. I closed my eyes. There are some wounds that can be repaired and others that can only be carried differently. The damage in my house could be undone. Locks restored, belongings brought back inside, legal rights reaffirmed. But the knowledge of who my son became under pressure, that would not be undone, only lived with. You can open the door, I said. You can bring my things back in. You can tell the truth when people ask what happened. That would be a start. He was quiet, then softer. Will you come home? I did not answer right away. Because home had become two things now, the physical place where Harold's slipper still sat by the bed, and the old feeling of safety that place no longer held in the same way. I'll come this afternoon, I said. With Evelyn. All right. And Caleb. Yes. Do not let me arrive to find that woman waiting to explain herself in my kitchen. His voice dropped. She won't be there. When I hung up, I stood in that quiet hallway longer than necessary. Then I went back into Mr. Benton's office and said, I'm going home. He nodded once. Take copies of everything with you. Evelyn drove again because she did not trust my hands on the wheel and because, in her words, if that girl pops out from behind a hydrangea, I want witnesses. The ride to Juniper Lane felt longer than it ever had. Every landmark seemed sharpened by dread. The gas station where Harold bought chewing gum. The elementary school where I had once volunteered in Caleb's third-grade classroom. The turn past the little brick church with the peeling white sign. When we pulled onto my street, I saw my suitcases were no longer on the porch. That should have comforted me. Instead, it made me wonder what else had been moved. Caleb's truck was in the driveway. So was his sedan. He must have left in a hurry the day before and returned in a greater one. The front door stood closed, familiar and newly strange. Evelyn squeezed my hand before I got out. You don't have to be strong for him, she said. I know. But strength has many costumes. Sometimes it looks like tears. Sometimes it looks like saying very little at all. Caleb opened the door before I reached it. He looked awful. Not performatively awful. Genuinely wrecked. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale beneath the stubble he had forgotten to shave. He looked like a man who had not slept and had not liked what wakefulness showed him. For one disorienting second I saw all his ages layered together. My grown son, the boy with Harold's eyes, the teenager pretending not to care, the father of two little girls, the man who had failed me. Mama, he said. I did not hug him. I stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell. My house no longer smelled like mine. It smelled faintly of bleach and one of Tiffany's expensive candles, citrus and cedar, too sharp, too curated. She had always liked things to smell fresh, which often meant erasing every softer scent in a room until nothing human remained. I stood in the foyer and let my eyes move slowly. The family photo from Myrtle Beach was gone from the wall. I turned. Where is it? Caleb blinked. What? The picture. He looked over his shoulder, then into the den. I think Tiffany moved some things yesterday when she was cleaning up. Cleaning up. I closed my eyes for one breath. Find it. He did. It was wrapped in newspaper on the dining room table, along with several other framed photographs and two brass candlesticks that had belonged to Harold's mother. Wrapped. As if they were already halfway to a yard sale. Caleb set the photo back where it belonged without my asking. Then I walked room to room. I did not rush. The den still held Harold's recliner, his blanket folded over one arm. The indentation of his body seemed to remain in the cushion, which nearly brought me to my knees. In the kitchen, my spice rack had been reorganized alphabetically in Tiffany's style, labels facing out like a display. In the guest room, 2 drawers had been emptied, perhaps to make room for me had I been allowed back in under better terms. And in my bedroom, my jewelry box sat open. Not emptied, just open. I stood there staring at it while a coldness spread through me that had nothing to do with grief. Caleb, I called. His footsteps came quickly. Yeah. I pointed. Who opened that? He looked at the jewelry box and then away too fast. The answer arrived before he gave it. Tiffany was helping me pack a few valuables, he said. For whom? He had no answer. I turned and looked at him fully then. Was your wife preparing me to leave, or was she preparing this house to be hers? He flinched as if I had struck him, and because truth, when spoken plainly, often sounds cruel to the people who have been hiding from it. Caleb sat down hard on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, both hands over his face. I don't know anymore, he said into his palms. It was the most honest thing he had said since Harold died. I stood at the dresser, one hand resting on the cool wood, and looked around the room Harold and I had shared for 3 decades. My side table still held the lavender hand cream I used before bed. His side still held the little lamp with the pull chain he fixed twice because I didn't want to replace it. His Bible was on the nightstand, a bookmark tucked halfway through Psalms. This room had held sickness, prayers, long silences, and the final breath of my husband. And yet what made my chest tighten in that moment was the realization that another woman had stood in here opening drawers and making plans. Not because she loved the space, because she wanted control of what came after loss. "Get up," I said. Caleb lifted his head slowly, eyes wet. "I'm not going to talk to you with you folded up like a guilty child," I said. "Get up and look at me." He obeyed. The thing about motherhood is that even when a child is grown and wrong, some part of your body still remembers the weight of him in your arms. It can make righteous anger feel heavier than it should. It can tempt you into gentleness before truth has finished speaking. I did not let it tempt me that day. "Did you know she opened my things?" I asked. He swallowed. "Not all of them. That wasn't the question." His shoulders sagged. "I knew she was packing." "Did you stop her?" No answer. "Did you tell her this was my home?" He looked down. "Did you tell her she had no right to touch my bedroom?" His voice came out thin. "I should have." "Yes," I said. "You should have." We stood there in the wreckage of what should have been obvious. Finally he said, "She kept saying we had to think ahead." I laughed softly, but there was nothing warm in it. People say think ahead when they want to skip over the part where somebody still deserves respect. He opened his mouth, then closed it. So I continued. "You know what your father said to me? He said if you let someone do wrong while you stood there quiet, that wrong would belong to you too." Caleb's face crumpled at that. "He said that. He knew you." That landed harder than shouting ever could have. I turned away then because I suddenly could not bear to spend another minute in that room discussing moral failure where Harold had died. Some spaces deserve better air than that. In the kitchen, Evelyn was leaning against the counter with her arms folded, watching the doorway like she expected Tiffany to materialize in a cloud of expensive perfume and excuses. She raised one eyebrow when she saw my face. "Well, he knew more than I wanted him to," I said. Evelyn nodded grimly. Caleb came in behind me and stood near the table, not sitting, not speaking. The kitchen clock ticked loud in the silence. Then I said, "We need to talk through exactly what happened. Start at the beginning." He rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. "After the graveside service, Tiffany said you shouldn't be alone and that maybe it would be easier if you stayed with Aunt Evelyn for a few days. She said she'd pack a bag for you and make up the guest room for me to stay here with you if you wanted." I stared at him. "So she offered two opposite plans in one sentence," I said. "And that didn't trouble you?" He flinched. Evelyn muttered, "Lord, give me restraint." Caleb went on, voice low. "I told her I needed to drop the girls off first. She said she'd head to the house and get some things started." "Started," I repeated. He nodded miserably. "When I got there later, the locks were already changed. Your stuff was outside. I told her she'd gone too far. And then," he looked toward the sink, "she said if we backed down now, nothing would ever change. She said you'd guilt me into letting things stay the same forever." I let that settle. Nothing would ever change. There it was again, that idea that my continued existence in the home I built was some obstacle to their progress. As if age itself were clutter. As if widowhood were an opening on a calendar. What did change mean to her? I asked. He hesitated. "Caleb." He took a breath. She thought, maybe eventually we could move in. Even Evelyn, who had guessed as much long before I had, straightened at that. I felt something inside me go very still. "Eventually," I repeated. He nodded once, not looking at me. "Was this your idea too?" "No," he said quickly, then slower. "Not at first. Not at first. A person can confess in fragments when shame won't allow a full sentence." I moved to the table and sat down because my knees had begun to tremble. Not from fear this time. From the sheer weight of final understanding. "She's been planning this," I said quietly. "For how long?" "I don't know exactly. But you knew she wanted the house. She said it made sense," he whispered. "You'd be alone here. We're cramped where we are. The girls need more space. Dad's health was declining and what?" I asked, lifting my eyes to him. You both started measuring the curtains before the body was cold? No, he said, too loudly, then lowered his voice at once. No, it wasn't like that. I thought of the missing photographs, the open jewelry box, the moved furniture, the new lock, the speed of it all. Yes, I said. It was. He sank into a chair then, looking suddenly years older. She said it would still be your home for now, he murmured. That we could help manage things. That eventually maybe we could renovate and make room for everyone. For now. That phrase sat in the room like spoiled milk. Tiffany had not seen me as a widow. She had seen me as a transition period. I looked at my son, my only child, my flesh, the boy I had once held upright through fevers and heartbreak and self-doubt, and I saw with heartbreaking clarity the adult compromise that had brought us here. He had not woken up one morning and decided to throw his mother out. It was worse than that. He had yielded one small piece at a time. A conversation here. A silence there. A nod when he should have objected. A retreat when he should have stood. That is how a man loses himself. Not in one dramatic leap, but in a series of convenient surrenders. What did you tell your daughters? I asked. He looked startled. What? When they asked why Daddy and Mama were at Grandma's house changing things after Papa died. What did you tell them? His mouth opened then shut. Exactly. Children are often the cleanest mirror. They force adults to hear how ugly their behavior sounds in plain language. Evelyn set her coffee cup down. You know what gets me? She said, looking directly at him. It's not just that your wife wanted the house. Greedy people want things every day. It's that she counted on you being too spineless to stop her. Caleb shut his eyes. I should have told her not to say it. I didn't. Because grief strips away politeness, and some truths need blunt edges. At last he looked at me and said, What do you want me to do? I answered immediately. I had known since the parking lot. First, you tell the truth. To me. To Mr. Benton. To anyone in this family who asks what happened. No more softening it. No more saying people were emotional or confused. Your wife changed the locks on my house while I was at your father's funeral. He nodded, tears standing in his eyes. Second, every item moved, touched, packed, wrapped, or opened gets put back exactly where it belongs unless I say otherwise. Another nod. Third, Tiffany does not enter this house again unless I invite her. His face tightened. Mama. No. The word came out calm as still water. She lost the right to comfort before she chose cruelty. If you want to save your marriage, that is your business. But you will not ask me to make room inside my grief for the woman who helped herself to my home. He sat very still. Then he whispered, Okay. For the next 3 hours, Caleb worked in near silence. He unwrapped photographs and rehung them on the walls. He returned the candlesticks to the mantel. He carried my suitcases back into the bedroom and unpacked them under my direction, folding sweaters with hands that kept trembling. He found my bent church hat and set it gently on the dresser like an apology too small to speak. I watched more than I helped. Not because I wanted to punish him with labor. Because I needed to see whether he could bear the discomfort of repairing what he had allowed. Repair reveals character in ways remorse alone never does. Evelyn stayed until late afternoon, partly to support me, partly because she did not trust the day not to produce fresh foolishness. At one point she stood in the den, looked at Harold's recliner and said quietly, He'd be proud of you, you know. I didn't answer. Pride from the dead is a complicated comfort. I would have traded every legal safeguard Harold put in place just to hear him cough from the next room one more time. Around 4 o'clock my sister hugged me hard, whispered, Call if you need me, even if it's just to sit, and left. That was when the house changed again. Without another person's energy in it, the rooms seemed to exhale. Grief came back fuller, sharper. The practical work had been a shield for a few hours, but once Evelyn's car pulled away and Caleb stood uncertainly by the kitchen table, all that remained was loss and the wreckage around it. Do you want me to stay tonight? He asked. I looked at him. He meant well, perhaps. Or wanted to. But care offered after betrayal can feel like a stranger trying on your husband's coat. No, I said. Mama, I don't think you should be alone. A sad little smile touched my mouth. You were not worried about me being alone yesterday. He looked as if the words had physically struck him. I deserve that, he said. Yes, I replied. You do. Then because I am not cruel, and because truth need not always be sharpened to draw blood, I added, I need quiet more than company tonight. He nodded. All right. At the door he stopped. Tiffany wants to talk to you. I nearly laughed at that. I'm sure she does. She says she was trying to. I know what she says she was trying to do, I interrupted. And I know what she did. He lowered his eyes. Tell her this, I said. There are some doors in life you don't get to reopen just because the law reminded you where the hinges are. He stood there for a second, absorbing that. Then he left. When the house finally closed around me, I did not turn on the television. I did not make dinner. I did not sort sympathy cards or answer voicemails or tidy any of the little visible signs of recent upheaval. I walked into the den, sat down in the chair across from Harold's recliner, and let myself be a widow. People rarely talk about the first true evening alone after a funeral. Not the logistical loneliness of sleeping by yourself. The spiritual one. The moment when no casseroles are arriving, no pastor is praying, no family member is hovering, and the silence of the house reveals the exact dimensions of who is missing. The clock in the den ticked loudly. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. Somewhere on the back patio, wind chimes knocked together in the fading light. Harold had always said those chimes sounded like old spoons in a drawer. I had laughed every time. I cried then. Not for the lock. Not for Tiffany. Not even for Caleb. For Harold. For the unfinished things. For the empty recliner. For the way his slippers still pointed toward his chair, as if he might come back and step into them. For every ordinary evening we would not have. For the fact that even in dying, he had spent some of his remaining strength protecting me from the family fracture he feared would follow. At some point I must have dozed off sitting upright, because I woke in the dark with my neck stiff and the room blue with moonlight. For one confused second I thought Harold was in the bathroom and would be back any minute. Then memory returned all at once, heavy and complete. I went to bed without brushing my hair. The next morning brought what I should have expected. Phone calls. First my cousin Bernice. Then one of the women from church. Then Harold's older brother Leon. Nothing travels faster through a family or a church than conflict tied to death and property. People dress it up as concern, but curiosity often rides in the front seat. I answered Leon because he was Harold's brother, and because he had always been kind to me. Sandra, he said, voice careful. I heard there was some upset at the house yesterday. I stood at the kitchen sink looking out at the hydrangeas Harold had fussed over. Their leaves were beginning to curl at the edges from summer heat. There was, I said. He waited. Leon was not a gossip by nature. He was asking because he loved Harold and because stories, once released into a family, rarely stay shaped like the truth unless someone bothers to hold them there. So I told him plainly. No dramatics. No embellishment. No tears. I told him I had returned from Harold's funeral to find my belongings on the porch and the locks changed. I told him Tiffany had said Caleb had chosen his real family. I told him Harold had legally protected the house and anticipated pressure after his death. I told him I was back home now and matters were being handled. When I finished, Leon was silent for several seconds. Then he said, quietly and with deep disappointment, "My brother would not have tolerated that." "No," I said. He did not. By lunchtime, 3 more relatives had called. By evening, Mrs. Pritchard came over under the pretense of returning a casserole dish I had never lent her and said, with all the solemn delight of a woman holding hot neighborhood intelligence, "I just want you to know I saw those bags on your porch yesterday and thought, this cannot be right. I should not have found comfort in that. I did. Because public humiliation can make a person feel crazy, and there is relief in having someone else confirm that yes, the thing that happened was exactly as wrong as it felt." Within 48 hours, the story had spread through our church circle, the neighborhood and Harold's side of the family. Not because I campaigned, because actions performed in broad daylight have a way of testifying for themselves. And with every retelling, one fact stayed sharp. They did it on the day of the funeral. That detail carried its own moral force. People might disagree over money. Families might quarrel over houses. But timing reveals character with a cruelty no explanation can wash clean. 2 days later, Caleb came by alone. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets like a teenager asking forgiveness after wrecking the car. I let him in, but I did not invite him to sit until he had something to say. I told Uncle Leon the truth, he said. And Aunt Marcia. And Pastor Reed. I nodded once. Good. He looked around the room as if seeing it differently now, not as square footage, not as inherited possibility, but as a place built by two people whose labor he had mistaken for convenience. Tiffany is furious, he admitted. That does not surprise me. She says everyone is making her out to be some kind of monster. I folded my hands in my lap. People usually resent accurate consequences. He gave a strained half-laugh despite himself, then looked ashamed for doing it. After a moment he said, "She didn't think your name was on as much as it was." There it was. Not only greed but assumption. A quiet old-fashioned wife in a long marriage. Surely she hadn't understood the paperwork. Surely the house was really Harold's in some deeper sense. Surely widowhood would make me pliable. She thought wrong, I said. He nodded. Yes. Then he added, almost in a whisper, so did I. I looked at my son for a long time before answering. Thank you for saying that, I said at last. But understanding your mistake is not the same as repairing what made it possible. He lowered his eyes. I know. Do you? He looked up again, and this time there was less self-pity in his face, more fatigue. More truth. I think I'm starting to. So I asked him the question that had been waiting beneath all the others. When did you stop seeing me as a person and start seeing me as a problem to solve? It took the color out of his face. I never. Don't answer too fast, I said. Think. He did. I watched him sit with it, really sit with it, and for the first time since Harold died I saw something like honest shame settle over him. Not the shame of getting caught, but the shame of recognizing himself in an uglier mirror than he expected. Finally he said, "It wasn't one moment." No, I said. It usually isn't. He rubbed his palms against his jeans. After Dad got sick, everything felt like logistics all the time. Doctor visits, money, schedules, the girls' work. Tiffany kept saying we had to be realistic. That we needed to think ahead. That if we didn't make plans, we'd all be left scrambling. And at first it sounded sensible. He glanced around the room. Then she started talking about how hard it would be for you here alone. How expensive the house might become. How much work it was. She said maybe eventually moving in with us would make more sense. Then later she said maybe we should move here instead. He swallowed. Every step sounded small when she said it. That is how people lead others into wrong, I said quietly. They make each step feel smaller than the destination. He nodded, tears rising again. I told myself I was being practical. No, I said. You were being cowardly and calling it practical. He took that without defending himself. That mattered. The room was quiet for a while after that. Sunlight fell through the den windows and lit the dust in the air. Dust is humbling. It turns in the light where we can see it, but it has been there all along. At last Caleb said, I don't know what to do about my marriage. I almost told him that was no longer my concern. But motherhood, properly held, is not ownership. It is witness. It is saying what is true when your child is old enough to bear it. So I said, that depends on whether you want peace or integrity. They are not always the same thing. He stared at me. I continued. A man can keep a household quiet for years by avoiding hard truths. But eventually the bill comes due. You are paying part of it now. He sat back slowly, absorbing that in the same way he used to absorb a hard sermon, not eager for it but unable to dismiss it. Then he asked, Do you hate her? It was such a childlike question that for a moment I almost smiled. No, I said. Hate is too intimate. I see her clearly. That's different. He looked down at his hands. I used to think she was just strong, he said. Strong people do not need to displace the grieving to feel secure, I replied. He nodded. Before he left that day, he stood in the doorway and said, I'm sorry, Mama. This time I believed he meant it. Not because the words were more dramatic. Because they were emptier of self-protection. Still, apology is a seed, not a harvest. We'll see what you do with that sorrow, I said. After he left, life became quieter in some ways and messier in others. Tiffany sent 2 text messages the next day. The first read, "I never intended to hurt you. I was trying to think long-term for the family." The second came 3 hours later. "I hope one day you can see that my heart was in the right place, even if my timing was wrong." I stared at both messages for a long time. People who cannot fully admit wrongdoing often retreat into the language of intention, as if the hand matters less than the heart that guided it, as if locking a widow out of her own house can be reduced to poor timing. I did not answer. Mr. Benton, however, did his own kind of answering. A week after the funeral, he called me in to review the final reading of Harold's will and some additional paperwork. Caleb was there. Tiffany was not. Whether from shame, anger, or strategy, I did not know. The office was cool and smelled faintly of toner and old carpet. I wore a navy dress because black had begun to feel less like mourning and more like costume. Mr. Benton read the relevant portions in his steady legal voice. The house to me outright. The investment account and trust to remain available, unless there had been coercion, dispossession, or interference with my residence. The explicit clause naming such conduct. And finally, Harold's handwritten letter of intent, attached for clarity. When Mr. Benton finished, the room sat in silence. Caleb's eyes were red again, but he did not argue. He did not ask for loopholes. He did not say Tiffany misunderstood. He simply nodded once, like a man accepting that his father had known where to place the line. "Will the trust still stand?" he asked quietly. Mr. Benton looked at me before answering, which surprised me. "In light of the attempted exclusion," he said, "the original structure as written has been voided. However, Mrs. Whitaker retains discretion over whether to create alternative educational support directly for the grandchildren if she wishes." I turned to look at Caleb. His face crumpled with something more complicated than disappointment. It was grief tangled with recognition. The money was not merely money. It was his father's final measure of trust, and he had damaged it. "That decision can wait," I said. He nodded, unable to speak. "And that was justice, I think. Not punishment for punishment's sake. Consequence aligned with character." Harold had wanted to provide for his granddaughters, but not at the cost of rewarding coercion or placing control in the hands of people who had already shown what they would do with power. Weeks passed. The phone calls slowed. The casseroles stopped. The funeral flowers dried at the edges and were thrown out one stem at a time. I learned the shape of evenings alone. I paid bills. I sat on the porch at dusk. I cried when I needed to. I sorted Harold's shirts by touch because some losses are easier to face one fabric at a time. Caleb kept coming by. Not every day, but often enough to show effort. Sometimes he mowed the lawn without speaking much. Sometimes he fixed small things Harold used to handle. A sticking cabinet hinge, a leaky faucet, a porch light. He did not ask for praise. That mattered too. Tiffany stayed away. Then, about 6 weeks after the funeral, she appeared at my church. Not beside Caleb. Alone. She was dressed simply, no glossy armor this time. Navy dress, low heels, little makeup. She waited until after the service while people milled around under the fellowship hall lights with coffee and pound cake balanced on paper plates. Then she approached me where I stood near the coat rack speaking to Mrs. Hendricks. "Sandra," she said. The room around us did not go silent exactly, but attention shifted. You can feel that when a community knows enough to recognize a reckoning. I turned to face her. "May I speak with you?" For one brief second I considered saying no. Not out of cruelty. Out of self-preservation. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from being asked to receive remorse from someone who first denied you dignity. It is not always noble to listen. Sometimes it is simply one more burden placed on the injured party because the person who caused harm wants relief. But we were in church, under the low fluorescent lights of the fellowship hall, with pound cake on folding tables and the murmur of after-service conversation drifting around us. Mrs. Hendricks, to her credit, took one look at Tiffany's face and said, "I just remembered I left my handbag in the pew," though her handbag was clearly on her arm. I nodded to Tiffany. Outside. We stepped onto the side walkway near the flower beds. The late morning sun was warm, and somewhere behind the building the children from Sunday school were laughing as they ran circles around the fellowship van. Tiffany stood with both hands clasped too tightly in front of her, her knuckles pale. She looked different. Not transformed. not humbled into sainthood, just stripped of polish. Her confidence no longer sat on her shoulders the same way. There were faint shadows under her eyes. She had lost some of that immaculate composure she wore like a tailored coat. "I won't keep you long," she said. "That would be wise." She flinched only slightly. Then she took a breath and said, "I came to apologize." I waited. People reveal the quality of their apology by what comes after that sentence. She looked down at the concrete between us. "What I did was wrong. Simple. Direct. Better than I expected." Still I said nothing. She went on. "Changing the locks. Packing your things. Speaking to you the way I did. All of it." The words came carefully, as though she had practiced them enough to make them stand upright without collapsing into excuse. "And why was it wrong?" I asked. Her eyes lifted to mine, and for a moment I saw irritation flicker there. Not because I had challenged her, but because some people can say sorry more easily than they can bear examination. But the irritation passed. "Because I treated you like an obstacle," she said quietly. "Not a person." I did not react. She swallowed. "And because I used your grief as an opening." That one hit closer to honesty than I would have guessed she could get. A warm breeze lifted a loose strand of hair near her temple. Somewhere behind us a church door opened and shut. "I told myself I was planning," she continued. "I told myself I was being practical, thinking about Caleb, the girls, what made sense. But—" She stopped, then tried again. "The truth is I wanted control. And I resented how much of Caleb still belonged to this house, to you, to the life he had before me." There it was. Not the whole truth, perhaps, but a truth. Jealousy rarely introduces itself plainly. It dresses up as efficiency, boundaries, common sense, moving forward. But underneath it is often just hunger to be central, chosen, unquestioned. "You were in competition with a mother and a history," I said. "That is a fight no wise woman picks." Her face tightened. "I know that now." "Do you?" I asked. "Or do you only know that it cost you something?" That landed. She looked away, out toward the parking lot where sunlight flashed on windshields. "Both," she admitted. I respected that more than if she had claimed pure moral awakening. For a while we stood there without speaking. I was not trying to be dramatic. I was measuring. Not whether she deserved forgiveness. People often ask the wrong question there. The better question is whether forgiveness, in any form, can exist without pretending the wound was smaller than it was. Finally I said, "Why today?" She gave a small humorless laugh. "Because Caleb told me if I was going to apologize, I had to stop doing it by text message and stop using words like misunderstanding." I almost smiled despite myself. "That sounds like his father," I said. A shadow crossed her face. "Yes." Then after a pause, "He moved into the guest room." This surprised me enough that I looked at her more sharply. "At your house?" She nodded. 2 weeks ago." I said nothing. "He told me he couldn't share a room with me while I was still defending what I did." And there, finally, was evidence of movement in my son. Small, late, imperfect, but real. Tiffany drew in a breath. "I'm not asking you to pretend this didn't happen. I know it did. I know people know. I know I deserve that. I just—" Her voice wavered for the first time. "I need you to know that I can see it now. I can see how ugly it was. There are apologies that ask to be absolved and apologies that ask only to be heard. This was somewhere between the two. I thought of Harold then. Not in some saintly beyond the grave way. Just Harold, with his quiet gaze and his habit of letting people reveal themselves fully before deciding what was true about them. So I said, "I accept that you are sorry." Her eyes lifted quickly. That was not the same as saying all was well. She knew it. "I do not trust you," I continued. "And trust is not rebuilt by one church parking lot conversation. It is rebuilt very slowly, if at all, by conduct. By restraint. By truth. By accepting that some access has been lost." She nodded, tears standing in her eyes now. "I understand." "Good. Because here is what else is true." My voice stayed calm. "You did not just insult me. You desecrated a house that had barely finished witnessing my husband's death. You turned a funeral day into an opportunity. Do you understand that part? Not strategically. Morally." A tear slid down her cheek. She did not wipe it away right away. Yes, she whispered. I think I will be understanding that for a long time. That too felt honest. I looked toward the church doors. People were starting to leave in little clusters, purses over shoulders, Bibles under arms, everybody carrying home a little piece of one another's business whether they meant to or not. I am not going to be cruel to you, I said. But neither am I going to rush myself for your comfort. If I speak to you politely, that is not reconciliation. If I let you sit at a table one day, that is not restoration. Those things may come, or they may not. You will have to live with the uncertainty your own actions created. She bowed her head. Fair. Then very softly, thank you for hearing me. I nodded once. Before she turned away, she hesitated. There's one more thing. I waited. The girls miss coming by your house. That reached a tender place in me instantly, because children are always the loosest threads in any family tearing. My granddaughters had been mostly kept away in those first painful weeks, and I had missed them with an ache separate from everything else. But I knew enough now not to let longing make me foolish. I missed them too, I said. And that is precisely why adults should behave better. She closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. After she left, I stood there alone for a moment, listening to the wind move through the crepe myrtles beside the church wall. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel healed. I felt sober. Sometimes the closest thing to peace is simply having no more illusions left to defend. That afternoon, Caleb came by with the girls. Lila ran into my arms so hard I had to grab the doorframe to steady us both. The younger one, June, buried her face in my skirt and asked in a muffled voice, "Can we make biscuits?" I nearly cried right there on the porch. "Yes, baby," I said. "We can make biscuits." And in that moment, I knew with sudden certainty that whatever shape the future took, I would not let adult ambition rob those children of every soft place connected to this house. That afternoon, flour dusted my countertop, butter softened in a chipped white bowl, and my granddaughter stood on mismatched step stools in the kitchen I had once thought I might lose. Lila was old enough to be serious about measuring. June preferred chaos. She pressed the biscuit cutter down too hard, twisted when I told her not to, and laughed every time the dough stuck and came up crooked. "Grandma, this one looks like Texas," she declared. "It does not look like Texas," Lila said with the enormous dignity of an older sister. "It looks like a cloud," I said, rescuing the misshapen piece and setting it on the tray anyway. "And clouds bake just fine." The girls giggled. Caleb stood by the sink watching us, hands in his pockets, quiet in a way that felt less evasive than before, more humbled. Every now and then he reached for a dish towel or refilled a cup without being asked. He looked like a man learning that repair often begins in ordinary service, not in speeches. The kitchen smelled like flour, warm milk, and the first rise of biscuits in the oven. For the first time since Harold's funeral, the house carried a sound that felt like itself again. Not just memory, not just sorrow, but life. And grief, I have learned, does not hate life. It only resents being asked to stop speaking too soon. After the girls ate, June climbed into Harold's recliner out of habit and curled up with a picture book. The sight pierced me and comforted me at once. Lila sat at the dining table drawing Grandma's house, with a purple crayon roof and flowers too big for the windows. In her picture, all of us were stick figures holding hands in front of the porch. All of us. Children are merciful that way. They often draw hope before adults know whether they deserve it. When it was time for them to leave, Lila hugged me and whispered, "Mama cried last night." I smoothed her hair back from her face. "Grown-ups cry too, baby." She nodded as if this confirmed something important. After they left, I stood in the doorway and watched Caleb buckle them into the car. He turned back once before getting in, and there was a question in his face he didn't ask aloud. Maybe about hope. Maybe about whether he was still my son in a way that could survive what had happened. I lifted one hand in a small wave. That was all I had for him that day. Summer moved on. The hydrangeas browned and then were cut back. I learned how to sleep without listening for Harold's cough. I boxed up some of his clothes but kept too many because widowhood has its own math, and no outsider gets to tell you which shirt is just a shirt and which one still holds a shape your hands need. I met with Mr. Benton twice more. In the end, after much prayer and more thought than anyone but Harold would ever know, I did establish a revised educational trust for the girls, one controlled entirely outside Caleb and Tiffany, with strict conditions and oversight. Not because I had softened toward what happened, because the children had done nothing wrong, and I would not let their future become collateral damage in an adult failure. When I told Caleb, he cried. Not out of relief, I think, but because mercy feels different when it arrives through a doorway you nearly burned down yourself. His marriage to Tiffany did not heal quickly. Perhaps it still has not fully. I am not inside it, and I no longer tried to be. What I know is this: he began setting boundaries in ways I had never seen before. Small ones first, then harder ones. He stopped letting her narrate every conflict. He corrected her in real time once at my table when she referred to Juniper Lane as the family property. He said plainly, "It's my mother's home." The room went quiet. Tiffany lowered her eyes. I said nothing, but inside me something old and bruised shifted. Not forgiveness exactly. Recognition. Months later, on a cool Saturday in October, Tiffany came with Caleb and the girls for supper. It was the first time I had invited her into the house since the funeral. I chose the date carefully. I cooked pot roast, butter beans, and cornbread because Harold loved all three, and because I wanted no part of that evening to pretend he had not existed at the center of this family. Tiffany arrived carrying a pie she had baked herself. Not bought. Baked. I knew because the crust was uneven at the edges. She handed it to me and said only, "I brought dessert." I took it. "Thank you." That was enough. At the table, she was quieter than she used to be. Not meek. Just less certain that every room belonged to her once she entered it. She let the girls chatter. She asked before clearing plates. She did not once rearrange my kitchen. These may sound like tiny things, but dignity is often repaired in tiny things first. After supper, while the girls played in the den and Caleb took the trash out, Tiffany lingered by the sink as I wrapped leftovers. "Your roast is better than mine," she said. I glanced at her. "Practice." A small smile touched her mouth. "Probably." Then she added without looking at me, "I know being allowed back here is not a small thing." "No," I said. The deepest healing, though, came from understanding something I wish more women were taught earlier. Being needed is not the same as being respected. And being loved should never require you to shrink your rightful place in your own life. For years I had mistaken Caleb's dependence, Tiffany's management, and even some parts of Harold's gentleness for a kind of balance. But balance built on one woman's silence is just imbalance with good manners. I still miss Harold every day. Sometimes in ordinary moments most of all. When the faucet drips and I almost call for him. When I pass the hardware store and think he'd want to stop. When I make Sunday eggs and reach for the pepper before remembering no one is going to say, "Little more than that, Sandy." But missing him is no longer the same as drowning in his absence. He left me grieving, yes. He also left me prepared. And there is love in that too. One evening not long ago, Lila asked me, "Grandma, are you going to live in this house forever?" I looked around the den, at Harold's chair, the bookshelves he built, the family photographs back in their rightful places, the late light warming the floorboards we once admired from a room with no curtains. Then I said, "As long as the Lord lets me, and I still want to, yes." She smiled as if that settled the world. Maybe for a child it does. Maybe for an old house too. What I went through taught me something I wish more people understood before grief ever enters their home. Death does not create character. It reveals it. When someone in a family dies, love shows itself. But so do greed, resentment, fear, jealousy, and old wounds people thought they had hidden well. And sometimes the deepest heartbreak is not losing the person you buried. It is discovering what the living were willing to do before the flowers even faded. I do not tell this story because I enjoy shame or family scandal. I tell it because too many women, especially wives and mothers of a certain age, are made to feel temporary in the very lives they built. They are told to be practical, to keep the peace, to think of the younger generation, to avoid conflict, to let things go. And little by little, they are pushed to the edge of their own table until one day somebody acts surprised that they still expected a seat. But a lifetime of labor does not become invisible just because someone younger is impatient. A home you built with your hands, your sacrifice, your prayers, and your years is not a transition plan. A grieving widow is not an inconvenience. And dignity is not something you surrender just because the people hurting you share your last name. If you are listening to me right now and you have ever been made to feel like a burden in the family you helped hold together, I want you to hear this clearly. You are not a burden. You are not in the way. And you do not have to beg for respect where your life has already paid for it. As for Caleb, I love my son. I probably always will. Love does not vanish just because disappointment arrives. But love has changed shape. It has grown firmer bones. I no longer confuse loving him with protecting him from the truth of himself. As for Tiffany, I chose not to live in hatred. Hatred keeps a door open that wisdom would rather close. I see her for who she is, and I leave room for people to change if they are willing to do the slow, humbling work of it. But forgiveness, if it comes, must never be another name for pretending. And Harold? Well, Harold loved me enough to tell the truth before he died. Enough to protect me with paper, with foresight, and with a letter written in his own hand. Enough to remind me that what I built mattered, even if other people forgot. That kind of love still shelters a woman, even after the man is gone. So I'll ask you this. If you had come home from your husband's funeral and found your suitcases on the porch, what would you have done? Would you have gone back that same night? Would you have fought differently? Would you have forgiven your son? Tell me in the comments. And if this story touched you, stay a while. There are more stories here about family, betrayal, healing, and the quiet strength it takes to stand up when the people closest to you expect you to sit down. Take care of yourself. And if you can, protect your peace before somebody else tries to price it.